table, which is that these interventions sound a little different from the interventions that dominate the national conversation and federal policy in education. So, what's up with that, Jim? And I can be more specific.
No, it's fine. I've never gotten this question before, oh my goodness.
What's up with that?
So, I mean, it's a really interesting thing, right? We have a lot of our conversations where, you know, because the conversation almost always seems to start with this question about poverty or excellent schools. And then there are people who say, well, my goodness, like how can you insist that these schools do more when they're dealing with such pervasive challenges with these children? And then you have the folks who say, circumstances be damned. These people need to be held accountable for the outcomes of their children. And what we know, and it's been said so many times this morning, is we have to be much smarter about how we hold those things in tension. Hold people accountable for getting the very best, doing the best for our children, and getting the best out of our children, while we recognize what it actually takes in order to do that. What we tried to do in the context of the policies administration is recognize that, right? So President Obama, and I won't even try and quote him because it just always comes out terrible, but he basically said, look, when you look at the problems of poverty, they are multiple. We are not going to solve these challenges by coming out with single-shot solutions. We have to come with holistic and complete solutions. And so you look at the Department of Education, you see the Promised Neighborhoods program. You look at HUD, you see the Choice Neighborhood program. You look at the Sustainable School Communities program. These things are about integrating supports and services and putting high-quality education at the very center of the work. Then you look very specifically within the context of some of the more aggressive programs at the Department of Education, where you say, look, you know, whether it was Race to the Top or the school improvement grants, so there are sets of schools that have been worth performing. Now let's talk about where I'm from, DC. So I grew up in DC. The high schools in my neighborhood where I grew up in DC and Southeast that were bad then are the same high schools that we are working desperately to try and improve now. And I think if you look around the country, in most places, that high school or that school has been that school for a very long time. So the question is, how intensively are we willing to intervene? And in the past, the case has been, we have not been willing to intervene in an aggressive way. We've fallen prey to the Joe Clark theory. We throw a great principal at that school building. That's going to do it. They just need to get in there and get it done. We've thrown in great professional development of a variety of different kinds. We've not said, look, we need to stop this in its tracks. There are many ways to approach this challenge, but there's a pervasive culture of failure that needs to be disrupted. You disrupt that through aggressive change, changes in people, changes in culture, changes in context, and you enable that with resources that let you bring in all of the instructional strategies, but also create the flexibility and space for these other things to come in as well. Right? And so you look at the work that preceding this, that Bob did here in New York, where he had the foresight to say, you know, he says, we did with 220 community-based organizations. Right? So this success that is one of the few things that have been rigorously studied to show real outcomes in terms of turning around dropout factory high schools happened because it was a holistic approach. And it's upon that platform that we've built our basic frame for how we do the work. Now, the interesting thing is, it's not really hard to get people to be willing to consider some of the supports. The hard part is to get people to be willing to be disruptive. To be disruptive, to do the thing that is politically hard. And there's nothing harder than intervening aggressively in a low-performing school, especially in a high-poverty community. They don't believe you're going to bring something better. I mean, that's basically what it comes down to. And so you get pushed back regardless of what it is that you're trying to do.
So you mentioned a tension between accountability and then and then sort of resources and what it takes. And it's interesting, there seems also to be a tension between aggressive, disruptive action and then a need to calm and create support question to the rest of the panel. Is the existing federal and, here local New York City education policy direction sufficient to make the kinds of investments that you're talking about?
Give it to me first. My response would be maybe. I don't know. I think we have not, sufficiently over time worked together, across disciplines, across silos, across agencies enough to be able to answer that question. I mean, a lot of it is in, whether we're being strategic and thoughtful and planful. Very often we tend to go after the same monies in competition with one another, as opposed to saying, why don't we do this together and leverage those resources across a strategy, a long-term strategy that allows us to use lots of different resources, our human capital, as well as these additional money resources across programs. So I think one of the things that was exciting to me about coming to Children's Aid Society and starting the charter school is that it's an opportunity to leverage lots of different resources and funding streams across a strategy. So right now on the Upper West Side we have hundreds of people here from across the country who are engaged in this work of community schools, these full service schools from across the country. 53 different cities are there over the next couple days. And, there's a lot of people who are starting to say, well, what does that mean if you have a school that is serving a high needs population and you place a full service health clinic there, mental to dental, and you place case workers, preventative service workers in the same place, and you have these people working together in a coordinated fashion across their resources. So you bring all those resources to bear in the school environment to support kids, and everyone's capacity to respond, intervene, plan long term is developed because you learn from one another's work, and you can access each other much more readily. So to me the answer is, maybe, I don't know, we can always use more resources, but the way we currently think about how to go after those resources, how to leverage those resources, I think could be much more thoughtful and strategic if we began to think outside of our silos.
One thing that I'd like to add, and by pulling together a couple of threads that have been talked about so far, Bob used the word design, and Jim used the word disruptive. And then we've talked about the leaders and the teachers that we put into these very, very complex environments. And one of the things I think you can see, because Dreama was one of those leaders, and she was a phenomenal leader at PS 230, there really isn't, for most leaders and teachers, a deep understanding of the how. What am I supposed to do? And the how is something that, sure, an organization like ours, working with 60 schools or 20 schools, can explain the how. But I think what we're asking for is some description of the how that comes through the accountabilities that are shaped by Jim's level, the federal level, and also at the state level. Because as one principal said to me, right now, all I'm accountable for is moving the academic needle. Period, end of story. That's what my job is based on. But if I was accountable for building a high-performing, high-poverty school that, yes, delivered academic improvement, and the accountability led my thinking about what do I have to prioritize to get there, then I would start thinking, I'd have to start thinking about design. I'd have to start thinking about partnering with the community. I'd have to start thinking about my human capital in the building. But I think that great leaders and great teachers, in our experience, need something that helps them see the how of it. And I think accountability is one of the places that can help us there.
I would just add to that, I mean, I think Jim is right in saying there needs to be disruptive innovation, and the question becomes at what levels, and what levels of accountability for every player in the education system. So right now, we talk a lot about accountability, and the only people who feel the bite of that are teachers, principals, and students themselves. So groups like New Visions need to be held accountable for the support we're providing in schools. Schools of education need to be accountable for the quality of the teachers that they're putting into those schools, and they need to own the outcomes of the schools where their teachers are a majority. We need to ensure that the Department of Education is held accountable. And I don't mean this in fluffy ways, because I think you can kind of broadly say everybody needs to be accountable and nobody's accountable. So yes, we have to start with students, teachers, and principals. But at the end of the day, we need to really push for a disruption in the way we deliver education that is a little bit more fundamental. And we see signs of that. The Board of Regents, for example, entertained the idea that non-universities could grant master's degrees in education. Boy, I'd like to see that pushed to the nth degree. Because right now, a lot of teachers are going into schools and they aren't prepared adequately. They aren't trained in the things that Turn Around for Children knows about, or Children's Aid knows about. So we need to rethink that. I think district structures, New Visions, needs to be held accountable. Are we moving the needle across multiple levels? And if we're not, there has to be a consequence for us. So I think there needs to be disruptive innovation, and that has to include the way we think about accountability. It needs to be concrete. We need to go aggressively towards that and ensure that we're successful. The other thing I think that's interesting about this notion of disruptive, for some reason I'm going in my mind to Hillcrest High School. It's out in Queens. It's run by Steve Dutch. We've worked there for about 4.5 years. We've seen improvements in the graduation rate from about 50% 4 years ago to 75% today. And the disruptive innovation that has to occur at a school level is extraordinary. Steve talks about when they moved from a large comprehensive high school to small learning communities, literally locking his faculty in a room until they figured out their new office structure. We're talking about changes in culture, and culture trickles down to the smallest detail of how a school operates, and then ricochets up to questions of policy and incentives and overall policies that are generated by the city, the state, or the federal government. But we need to figure out ways to start to capture what happens in those disruptive moments in schools, because at the end of the day, it's really in those moments that we're going to see success, and all of our policy efforts have to be aligned to do that.